I have sat across the table from 7 species in 11 years of Concord service, and I have never once needed to revise my read on an enemy after a single session. I revised mine on humans in the space of 4 minutes, watching a screen, in a room built specifically so that no one would ever have to feel what I felt in it. My name is Ilvena Korsk. I hold envoy rank for the HFY Compact, which meant that when the truce talks over the Karas salient were finally called, I was the one seated at the long glass table aboard the Concord Spire, flanked by 2 military attachés and a war college analyst named Perter, who had briefed me personally before we boarded. Humans, Vitor told me, fight like weather. Sudden, total, and then gone. Break their supply lines, kill their momentum, and the anger does the rest. Humans hate efficiently, he said, and a species that hates efficiently can be worn down. It was good doctrine. It had cost us 4 fleets to learn it, and I believed every word of it walking into that room. The Concord Spire keeps its embassy level lit the way a hospital is lit. Flat, white, without shadow, so that no delegation can claim to have missed a gesture. Our side of the table sat 6. The human side sat 3. A negotiator, a logistics officer, and a woman in a plain gray field uniform with no rank insignia visible, who did not speak for the first half hour, and whom nobody at my table thought worth watching. I had read the standard human threat assessment twice on the transit shuttle, the way I read every assessment before a first session, and it told me what every prior assessment had told every prior envoy: short campaigns, disproportionate losses on our side in the opening engagements, and then, reliably, a plateau. Pertor's theory of the plateau was elegant. Humans burned hot and could not sustain it. Grief compounded, morale thinned, and somewhere in month 6 or 7, the anger that made them dangerous curdled into something we could work with, something that wanted the war over badly enough to negotiate from weakness. 4 fleets had paid to confirm the first half of that theory. Nobody had yet confirmed the second half. The talks themselves were procedural, until the matter of Karas Ridge came up, a skirmish 4 months prior, minor by any real measure, notable only because it was the engagement where an Ashkarai strike team had triggered a claim of misconduct against the human line. Our analyst had prepared the file. He expected footage that would embarrass the humans, or at least complicate their position. Instead, the woman in gray reached forward without asking and set a data spike on the table herself. "Play it," she said. Her voice had no weight in it at all. "You'll want the context before you finish the complaint." The screen above the table lit with a recording pulled from a suit cam, time-stamped and unedited. I watched 41 Ashkarai soldiers execute a flanking ambush on a human supply convoy along a frozen ridge. Good positioning, good discipline, the kind of engagement Pertor would have called textbook. Snow moved sideways across the frame in hard gray sheets. Our team came down off the high ground with covering fire timed well enough that I found myself, absurdly, admiring it. And then I watched it fail. A counter-response I did not recognize collapsed the ambush in under 90 seconds. No panic in it, no wasted motion, just a sudden reorganization of the human line that turned the ridge from a kill box into a trap running the other direction. The Ashkarai team broke and ran, leaving 6 of their own on the ice. 3 dead, 3 wounded, one of the wounded still armed. What the footage showed next was not what any of us at the table had prepared for. The human line did not pursue the retreat. They stopped. 4 soldiers broke off from their own formation, under continuing fire from a second Ashkarai position that had not yet disengaged, and moved onto the open ridge toward the wounded. I watched a human medic kneel over an Ashkarai private who still had a sidearm in his hand, watched her take the weapon from him with no more urgency than someone taking a cup from a child, and then watched her open a field kit and begin working on the wound in his side while incoming rounds struck the ice 11 meters behind her. The audio caught her voice, flat and unhurried, talking the soldier through something. Pressure, breathing, hold still, in a tone that did not change even when a round passed close enough to shear ice into the frame. They stabilized all 3 wounded. They carried them back across the open ridge under a fire discipline that never allowed the retrieval to be interrupted, and they left the 3 dead where they lay, marked with beacons, so that we could recover them later. The whole exchange, ambush to withdrawal, ran 6 minutes. The room did not speak for several seconds after the footage ended. I remember Prudictor's mouth open, no words behind it. I remember the sound of the War College file, still queued on his tablet, suddenly worthless in his hand. It was the negotiator who finally asked the obvious question, and asked it carefully. The way you ask something you are afraid has an answer you won't like. Why? Why stop? Why expose 4 soldiers to save the lives of the people who had just tried to kill them? The woman in gray answered before her own negotiator could. That's standard procedure, she said. Not an exception we made for the cameras. Wounded enemy combatant. We treat him the same as our own. Soon as the position's secure enough to try. Doesn't matter what unit he's from. Doesn't matter what he did an hour ago. She said this the way one of my own logistics officers might describe a fueling protocol. Without pride, without performance. As though she found the question itself slightly strange. If that's what you needed clarified before you dropped the misconduct claim, it's clarified. I understood, watching her, that this was not the exceptional case Praetor's doctrine required to hold. This was the baseline, and once I understood that, the entire architecture of what we had believed about humans came apart in my head, in the space of a breath. Because Praetor's doctrine had one requirement buried at its foundation that none of us had examined closely enough. That humans could be pushed into becoming something worse than themselves. That enough dead, enough atrocity, enough cost, would eventually curdle the anger into cruelty we could exploit, could point to, could use to turn their own worlds against them. You cannot wear down a species that will not become cruel no matter what you do to it. You cannot outsuffer an enemy who will still send 4 soldiers onto open ice to save the person who just tried to kill them, and who will do it again tomorrow, with the same flat voice. Because it isn't rage, and it isn't mercy performed for an audience. It's simply procedure, load-bearing, and permanent. The same on the worst day of the war as the first. Cruelty exhausts itself. It requires provocation, escalation, a reason. What I had just watched required none of those things, which meant it had no ceiling and no floor. It would still be standard procedure in 10 years. It would still be standard procedure after we had killed everyone that woman in gray had ever served with. I looked down the length of our table while the recess was called, and saw the same understanding arrive on every face at a different speed. Tor's analyst tablet had gone dark in his hands, the War College file still queued, and now, visibly, useless. Our senior attaché, a career officer who had commanded at Karras himself, was staring at the frozen final frame of the footage, the medic's kneeling silhouette, the beacon light she'd left blinking over the wounded private, with an expression I had only seen on him once before, after a fleet action he did not expect to survive. I did not say any of this aloud in the negotiating chamber. I said, on the record, that the compact would withdraw the misconduct claim, and I asked for a short recess. Praetor followed me into the corridor outside, and asked, quietly, whether the doctrine needed revision. I told him it needed to be burned, and that we would need something new to replace it, and that I did not yet know what that would be, because everything we had built our strategy on assumed an enemy that could eventually be made to hate as efficiently as we did. I filed my own report that night, before the talks resumed, because I did not trust myself to write it any less plainly, after sleep might soften what I had seen. I wrote that the compact's threat model had failed not at the level of tactics, but at the level of premise, and that no amount of additional data from additional engagements would change the conclusion, because the conclusion did not depend on how many times humans were tested. It depended on the fact that the outcome had apparently already been decided once, in some doctrine written long before any of us met them, and never revisited since. I recommended, formally, that the compact stop trying to calculate the point at which humans would break, and start operating on the assumption that no such point existed. I am not certain I fully believed it myself, until I watched that medic take the sidearm out of a dying enemy's hand, as gently as if it might wake him. I have sat across the table from 7 species. Only one of them, to my knowledge, has never once given us a version of itself we could use against it.